Today we're going over the massacre that no one believed until the photos arrived. A 6-week campaign of violence so methodical that Westerners who witnessed it risked their lives just to tell the world. And the photographs they smuggled out that changed everything. We're starting in December 1937. The city is Nanking, the capital of China. The Japanese Imperial Army has been at war with China for 5 months. Their soldiers have marched from Shanghai fighting every mile. Now they stand at the gates of Nanking. Inside the city are 600,000 civilians, plus 90,000 Chinese soldiers who have been ordered to hold the city at all costs. But the order came too late for an organized defense. On December 12th, Chinese forces begin a chaotic retreat. Thousands of soldiers discard their uniforms and melt into the civilian population. The Japanese army enters Nanking on December 13th. What follows is not a battle. It is 6 weeks of systematic violence documented by the perpetrators themselves. Japanese soldiers carried cameras. They photographed their own atrocities and sent the pictures home like vacation snapshots. These photographs would later become evidence, but that would come later. In the first days of occupation, tens of thousands of prisoners are executed. Chinese soldiers who surrendered are machine-gunned in groups along the Yangtze River. Civilians are pulled from their homes and killed in the streets. The international safety zone becomes the city's only refuge. It was established by a small group of Western missionaries and businessmen, Americans and Germans and Danes, who refused to evacuate. They drew a boundary around a small section of the city and declared it neutral territory. 200,000 civilians crammed into this tiny zone. They slept standing up, and they ate whatever scraps could be found. Every day, Japanese soldiers tested the edges of the zone. Every day, the Westerners stood at the gates and turned them away. Their names deserve to be remembered. John Rabe was a German businessman and a member of the Nazi Party. His Nazi armband gave him authority that the Japanese soldiers respected. He used that authority to shelter 250,000 civilians in his own compound. Rabe wrote a diary during the occupation. 10 volumes of meticulous documentation. He described everything he witnessed. He estimated the death toll at 50 to 60,000 in the first few weeks alone. Minnie Vautrin was an American missionary and the acting president of Ginling College. She turned the campus into a refuge for 10,000 women and children. Every morning she stood at the gates and pleaded with Japanese officers to spare her girls. She was outnumbered and outranked and terrified. She never backed down. Robert Wilson was the only surgeon remaining in the entire city, an American doctor who performed over 300 operations during the occupation. He worked until his hands bled, and he operated by candlelight when the electricity failed. The Japanese government controlled all press access. No photographs of what was happening in Nanking were allowed to leave the city. Newspapers in Tokyo printed triumphant stories of a liberated city. The outside world believed Nanking had been peacefully captured. Then the film reels arrived. John McGee was an Episcopal missionary who had smuggled a 16mm movie camera into the city. He filmed hours of footage hidden beneath his coat. He captured burned buildings and bodies in the streets and surgical procedures with no anesthesia. In January 1938, McGee's films were smuggled out of Nanking. A fellow American hid the reels in the lining of his coat and carried them past Japanese guards. The film reached the world press. When audiences in America and Europe saw the footage, they went silent. Newspapers began printing the truth. But Japan denied everything. They called it propaganda and Western fabrication. The photographs and the diaries and the films were dismissed as exaggeration. The debate over what happened in Nanking continued for decades, and it is still not fully settled today. China estimates the death toll at 300,000. International historians place it closer to 100 to 200,000. Even the lower number is staggering. A city the size of Nanking lost a quarter of its population in 42 days. John Rabe returned to Germany and was arrested by the Gestapo for telling the truth. He was forbidden from speaking about Nanking ever again. Minnie Vautrin suffered a mental breakdown and took her own life 1 year after returning to America. She could not escape what she had witnessed. John McGee's films were shown at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They were entered as evidence. They helped convict the Japanese commanders who had ordered and allowed the atrocities. But here is the thing that is hard to accept. Of the approximately 80 Japanese officers who were identified as being responsible for the Nanking Massacre, only 7 were ever prosecuted. The rest returned to civilian life. They became businessmen and politicians and grandfathers. And when the film reels were smuggled out of Nanking in January 1938, the world finally knew what had happened. But knowing and believing are two different things. It took a war crimes tribunal and thousands of pages of testimony and 16mm film footage just to prove that 6 weeks of horror was not propaganda. The photographs did not prevent what happened. They could not. The photographs only made it impossible to deny what had already occurred.